I'm John Strum, and this is Real Talk MS. It's December 3rd, and we have a lot to talk about. But before we get into today's episode, I have some sad news to share. Last week, the global MS community lost one of its heroes with the passing of Professor Giancarlo Comi. Professor Comi was a true visionary who authored over 1,000 scientific papers, edited numerous books, and presented his work at more than 600 scientific conferences around the world. Understanding the importance of early diagnosis and early treatment, Professor Comi promoted the introduction of MRI and the development of new MS diagnostic techniques. With the support of the Italian MS Society, Professor Comi was among the first in Italy to purchase an MRI machine dedicated to research at the Institute of Neurology at San Raffaele, Milan. Professor Comi led the MS Center of San Raffaele Hospital from its inception, and from 2008 to 2018 he served as the director of the Department of Neurology. In 2015, Professor Comi received the prestigious Charcot Award, an honor that acknowledged his place among the world's leading experts on multiple sclerosis. And in 2018, he was appointed an Officer of the Italian Republic by President Sergio Mattarella. From its early beginnings, Professor Comi was a strong supporter of the International Progressive MS Alliance, a first-of-its-kind global initiative that brought together the best and brightest researchers, industry experts, and people affected by progressive MS, with the common goal of solving the riddle of progressive MS and developing effective new therapies for people living with progressive multiple sclerosis. During my time as a member of the Alliance's Scientific Steering Committee, Professor Comi served as its co-chair. Professor Comi also understood and valued the importance of patient participation in research, becoming a champion of programs that were specifically designed to include the patient voice in MS research, programs like Multi-Act and the PROMS Initiative. And Professor Comi was my friend. We chatted often when we were together at International Progressive MS Alliance Scientific Steering Committee meetings, and I remember being at a very large MS research conference with thousands of attendees. As we were all gathering for a presentation in a cavernous ballroom that could accommodate a crowd of our size, I spotted Professor Comi at the far end of the ballroom and watched as he made his way across this massive space and through this crowd of people who were pouring in, just so he could say hello and ask how I was doing. Our community has lost a giant who has left a legacy of research that has in turn made life considerably better for people affected by MS. But we've also lost a kind, thoughtful, caring man who left an indelible impression on every person he touched. Professor Giancarlo Comi will be missed. I'm joined today by Dr. Kathy Zackowski and Mimi Brown to discuss the pros and cons of participating in clinical research. Dr. Zackowski is the Associate Vice President of Research at the National MS Society, and she's going to offer an overview of the risks and benefits that you'll want to weigh in considering participating in a clinical trial. Mimi Brown lives with primary progressive MS, and Mimi's going to share her own experience as a participant in multiple clinical trials. But before we get to my conversation with Mimi Brown and Dr. Kathy Zackowski, there are a few other things that you should know about. The Oxford Health Policy Forum has assembled a large group of neurology experts and published a report entitled Brain Health: Time Matters. This report is actually an update of a report entitled Brain Health: Time Matters in Multiple Sclerosis, which was originally published in 2015. This updated report not only covers brain health in MS, but adds neuromyelitis optica spectrum disorder, or NMOSD, and myelin oligodendrocyte glycoprotein antibody-associated disease, most often referred to as MOGAD. I won't try to speak specifically to NMO or MOGAD, but experts have certainly learned a lot about MS since 2015, so this updated report is both timely and welcome. The report begins by looking at how these three neurological conditions impact people in the real world. There's a discussion about the economic impact of these diseases on an individual level and on a broader societal level. The report explains the importance of early diagnosis and the benefits of early treatment. Comprehensive care is discussed, and the report's authors also focus on identifying the non-medical factors that often influence health outcomes. The report concludes with a discussion of future perspectives, including the expanding role of AI and technology in virtually every aspect of healthcare, from research to the clinic. Promising biomarkers that will improve both diagnosis and treatment are discussed, as is the need to update the terms that are used to describe MS. As the more scientists learn about MS, terms like relapsing remitting, secondary progressive, and primary progressive often limit the way research can be conducted, hindering the path to more effective personalized treatment for each individual living with MS. If you'd like to download a copy of the report or watch a video that highlights the key findings in the report, you'll find those links in today's show notes. And if you happen to have the free Real Talk MS app installed on your iOS or Android device, you'll find that report already waiting for you under the Bonus Content tab. MS is considered an autoimmune disease like type 1 diabetes, lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, and more than 80 other diseases that, when you combine their patient numbers, affect 50 million Americans and about 750 million people worldwide. Just as a quick refresher, in an autoimmune disease, the immune system mistakenly attacks the body's own cells, tissues, or organs, and these autoimmune attacks lead to inflammation and damage. In the case of MS, the immune system attacks the nervous system. In the case of type 1 diabetes, it attacks the pancreas. And in the case of lupus, the immune system can attack almost any organ or tissue in the body. Yet despite the vast differences between autoimmune diseases, there are similarities in the biological mechanisms that drive that autoimmune response. That's why the National MS Society has joined forces with Breakthrough T1D, an organization that was formerly known as the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation, and the Lupus Research Alliance to identify common mechanisms in autoimmunity. This jointly funded research program actually began in 2021, providing funding for several research studies aimed at expanding our understanding of the mechanisms that drive autoimmunity. And now these three organizations have announced that they're once again jointly funding another round of research projects that are focused on exploring common underlying disease mechanisms. I find this announcement newsworthy for two reasons. First, it's always encouraging to see new research being funded. These are the seeds from which progress grows. The other aspect of this funding announcement that I find deeply gratifying is seeing these three organizations collaborating on funding research. Too often, science lives in silos, with everyone ensconced in their laboratory, focused on their particular disease or condition, while in the real world, these conditions may share common characteristics, and the work being done in these laboratories can sometimes end up being redundant. Collaboration works, and it's great to see this collaborative approach to better understanding the underlying mechanisms that trigger an autoimmune attack. It offers the potential of achieving progress that will ultimately benefit hundreds of millions of people around the world. If you'd like to learn more about this collaborative effort to identify and understand common mechanisms of autoimmunity, you can visit decodingautoimmunity.org, and you'll find that link in today's show notes. On December 11th, the International Progressive MS Alliance is hosting a global webcast entitled What We're Learning from Clinical Trials. At the ECTRIMS annual congress this past September, the results of several clinical trials were presented that aim to find new treatments for MS. This webcast will feature a panel of researchers who were part of 3 different research teams that presented results from those clinical trials at ECTRIMS. The panel will discuss these trials, what they learned, and how they'll be taking that information forward into future research. Once again, this live webcast takes place on December 11th at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. That's 5 p.m. Central European Time. And you'll find a link to register for that webcast in today's show notes. As you watch this webcast, I hope that you'll not only learn about the specific clinical trials that will be discussed, I hope that you'll be inspired and perhaps come away thinking about how you might contribute to finding better, more effective treatments and even cures for MS by participating in a clinical trial. If that's the case, you're going to want to pay particular attention to my two guests, Dr. Kathy Zackowski and Mimi Brown, who in a moment are going to enlighten us on some of the things you'll want to consider when you're considering becoming a participant in clinical research. If you've ever taken medication or received rehabilitative therapy, then you've experienced the benefits of clinical research. Clinical trials are a major part of biomedical research, helping to determine if therapies are safe and effective. I'm joined today by Dr. Kathy Zackowski and Mimi Brown. Dr. Zackowski is a neurorehabilitation occupational therapist and the Associate Vice President of Research at the National MS Society. Mimi spent more than 35 years in a variety of executive roles in advertising, marketing, and sales of consumer brand products. Mimi's now retired, and she spends time volunteering for a nonprofit organization that provides services to youth experiencing homelessness. I'll start us off by saying welcome back to the podcast, Dr. Zackowski.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
I hope you'll start us off by explaining what clinical trials are and why they're so important.
Definitely. So a clinical trial is a research study that tests the safety and effectiveness of a new medical treatment or prevention in people. And people volunteer to take part in clinical trials to test these interventions. This could include drugs, cell therapies, surgical procedures, devices, behavioral treatments, and all the way down to prevention. But a major aim is to determine if a new treatment is better than an existing treatment or has fewer side effects.
Well, I just heard you start to answer my very next question. I think that when a lot of people think about clinical trials, they think about them in terms of determining whether a new drug is safe and effective. But there are other types of clinical trials that don't involve medications, aren't there?
There are a lot of different types of trials. So some trials that don't involve medications could be testing diets or different rehabilitation strategies like exercise or devices that can assist with walking. MS has a huge variety of symptoms, and our disease-modifying therapies are really effective at limiting relapses, but they don't specifically address symptoms. So rehabilitation therapies can address those symptoms, but we need to know enough about what type of intervention is best for you at what dose and what intensity. And that's where non-pharmaceutical intervention trials come into mind. So they require studying just those particular details. What dose of exercise, for example, do you need? And maybe when is that intervention most effective and for whom? So there are a lot of different ways to participate in clinical trials, but rehabilitation interventions are really very important.
Why should someone consider volunteering to participate in a clinical trial? And during their consideration, are there any risks to participating that they should be thinking about?
So it's really important to participate in clinical trials. I guess a big benefit is that it would give the person access to new treatments. You're learning about an intervention, whether it's a drug or a rehabilitation intervention, first before it's being given to the public. So that's a lot of people find that very interesting and exciting. You're also given access to expert care that is really interested in monitoring you and your progress while you're in this trial. It's also, if you look at the bigger picture, a big benefit of being part of a clinical trial is that you're helping to advance medical research. and contribute to the development of new treatments. So while there's no guarantee that participating in the clinical trial will help you, doing so undeniably helps others. And then last but not least, a big benefit that lots of people talk about is that, the trial is free to be part of, but often you will also have compensation and payment for your time and travel to be in the study. Those are the positives. Do you want me to hit on a few of the risks that maybe people should be aware of?
Absolutely.
Okay. So the study, any study has risks, and it's important that you know whether those risks are minor or major. And the only way you can do that is really by asking and asking lots of questions. Some studies are higher risk, and you need to understand what that means for you. A couple other risks are that, the treatment just might not work. It might not even be better than standard treatment, but we don't know that if we don't study it. It also might require more time and attention than a standard treatment. That could include, more clinical trial visits or procedures that you don't typically have to do. It also might be that you participate in a trial where you're assigned to a group that might not get the experimental treatment or might get the experimental treatment, and you might not have control over that particular feature. So one group might just get a placebo and not really the anticipated exciting new treatment. But although there are risks, it's just most important that you ask questions so you are aware of what those risks are and make sure that that's something you want to go through with.
We know that clinical trials help to determine whether a new treatment is safe for people. But how do the researchers running the trial know whether that new treatment is even safe enough for the people who are participating in the clinical trial?
Yeah, that's a really important thing to be aware of. So many studies start in a dish where we look at cells or with animal models. But when we think we know enough to start testing it in humans, that's is a very strategic approach. There are 4 specific phases for clinical trials, and these are good to know about. So phase 1 is usually testing a new drug or a new intervention in a very small group. And this is to identify side effects and safe dosage range. Phase 2 will test treatments that were safe in phase 1, but now need a larger group of human subjects to monitor for adverse effects. Then there's phase 3, and I guess you're following me now. It's going to be even a larger study, and even in different regions or different countries. And this is often the step right before a new treatment is approved. So most new treatments have to have completed phase 3 trials. And then phase 4 are those studies that take place after a country has already approved an intervention or a drug, but there's a need for further testing in a wider population over a longer time frame. So kind of knowing those phases gives you a lot of power, because you can decide if you want to be part of that phase 3 trial right before it gets approved, or if you're willing to be part of more of a phase 1 or phase 2 trial.
How can someone know whether a clinical trial is ethical, and how can they feel confident that their rights and their privacy will be protected during and after that clinical trial?
Yeah, very important. There is always in a clinical trial an informed consent. So researchers have to provide participants with an informed consent form that details the study's purpose, risks, benefits, and how their privacy will be protected. And you always have the right to ask at any time about any aspect of the trial, including the procedures, adverse reactions, or anything else. You're also entitled to keep all of your medical information, whether it was collected in the past or during the clinical trial, and it has to be kept confidential and private. And the most important thing is that you're given this consent form, but you have to read and sign the form that indicates to the researcher that you understand what you're going to be participating in. And it's not binding in that if you ever decide in the middle of the trial that you still want to get out, you've had enough, you always have the right to stop participating in any study at any time without affecting your regular medical care. So very important. It doesn't take away any of your regular medical care options.
So if I choose to participate in a clinical trial, and partway through it, I simply decide, it's really not for me, or maybe I have a work-related urgency that's going to cause me to travel and I won't be available for it. And for whatever reason, I choose to drop out. When that research team goes to write up the results of their clinical trial and publish them, they're not going to say, and John Strum dropped out of this clinical trial, are they?
No, they legally cannot ever mention your name. And, I would say be really aware that this is the scientist's livelihood. So your participation is very important to them. So if there are things that come up that you did not anticipate, I would go to them and say, look, I'm really sorry. Now I have to take a work trip. I don't know what to do. Should I drop out? And let them give you any options that might be there to allow you to still participate. Or, if they can't, then you say, I'm really sorry. And they should understand that this is what happens. And not everyone can't finish trials, but of course they could never name you or shame you in any way for being part of the study.
After a clinical trial is completed, are the results shared with the participants?
Yes. So according to ethical research practices, clinical trial results should be shared with participants after a study is completed. This is done typically in the form of a summary that is understandable to the general public, allowing everyone to understand the overall findings of the trial and how their participation contributed to that research. I will tell you that can take many forms. So some researchers will say, I'm publishing a paper, and they'll hand you a publication, and that's how the results may be shared. But regardless of the form, you should be able to have your results shared with you in a way that you understand.
So what's the best way for someone to learn about clinical trials for MS that are actively recruiting participants?
There's a couple of ways that I can think of. First of all, I would go to your local network, your friends, your local neurologist, other clinicians that you might see in an MS clinic or just in your medical clinic, because mostly people will know about local studies that are going on because the researchers, again, this recruitment process is really, really hard. So they're usually going to a lot of different clinicians and saying, look, here's my trial, and they'll tell them about it. So oftentimes that's a good way to do it. If you feel like you still aren't getting enough information, there is the National Library of Medicine's clinicaltrials.gov. And this is a database of all active clinical trials in the United States. It's free to anyone, and it provides information about the purpose of the trial, who can participate, locations, and even phone numbers for more details. And last but not least, the National MS Society also has a website. If you search participate in a clinical trial on the society's website, there's a button that helps you. Literally, it says find clinical trials in your area. So you can click that button and it should give you more information. So there are ways to get information about clinical trials. And I really encourage people to take those forms and give it a try and learn about it.
Well, now I'd like to welcome Mimi Brown to the podcast. Mimi, I want to thank you for giving us a few minutes to lay some foundation to our conversation.
I'm so glad to be here. Thank you, John.
So let's start at the beginning. When were you diagnosed with MS, and what's your MS journey been like?
It's been a very interesting journey. I first started having symptoms that turned out to be MS when I was 50 years old. That's a 50. So much later in life. And those symptoms kept progressing to the point that I sought out help from the Rocky Mountain MS Center here in Colorado. And they were able to do the deeper dive, and we did figure out what was going on. Knowledge is power, but it's also scary. They did a fabulous job of helping me understand my options, which are not a lot for progressive MS, primary progressive MS, but also my options for doing things that I can control: diet, exercise, stress management, so forth.
You've actually participated in more than one clinical trial. How did you learn about the clinical trials that you participated in, and what motivated you to enroll as a participant?
One of the first things that the clinic helped me with is connecting to a physical therapist that specializes in understanding MS patients and their needs. And it was really clear that I needed adaptive devices to support me, an AFO, a cane, and then some training. During the course of meeting with that physical therapist a couple of times, he's the one that actually shared with me there are some clinical trials going on related to research. Related to physical therapy. And would you be interested in participating? And I said, okay, tell me more, and asking questions. I think that the deciding factor for me was back to, well, okay, so this is something I can learn more about for myself. And this is something that might help me be able to control the things that I can control with this disease.
Can you explain what you did as a participant in one of these clinical trials?
Well, it was really quite fun to do this because we were working on vestibular things. I've done 3 or 4 trials, but the most of the focus has been on balance and movement, and the vestibular part, meaning where your eyes and head can kind of connect with the rest of your body and sense of space. I really enjoyed the inventiveness of what they were having me do between walking forwards and backwards, head up, head down, talking, counting, name the capitals of the country while you're doing all these all these movements. And I liked the fact that they, as part of this trial, they were doing a pre, a midpoint, and a post summary or assessment of how things were progressing. And they had kind of a computerized device that was attached to my body that could tell the difference in my movement and in my strength and in my balance. So it was pretty scientific.
Well, not only have you participated in clinical trials, you're also an advisory board member for the STEP for MS clinical trial. What are your responsibilities as an advisory board member, and what's your experience been like?
I also was very honored to be asked to be part of this STEP for MS advisory board because it's a national study focused on physical therapy and trying to understand physical therapy adaptations at home as well as in clinic. And so I thought this is going to be a fabulous way to help get the word out, knowing that physical therapy does help. The advisory board is made up of about 11 or 12 people, some of which are experiencing MS, others are doctors or healthcare insurance carriers or physical therapists. And we, at the very beginning, we've been on the journey with the investigators. There are a total of 8 different locations where people were recruited from. We were able to advise not only on the script for how they recruit people, but to how they describe the exercises, all the way through to asking questions about the data that it was being extracted. And then now we have the final study, which should be released in next year. So it's been a journey, about three or 4 years of this study. It's fascinating.
Someone listening to our conversation may be thinking about participating in a clinical trial. What advice would you give them?
I think Dr. Zackowski said it really well about asking a lot of questions. And she certainly covered the part that made most sense to me at the very beginning. I believe the next part has to do with the people that surround you and support you, because participating in a trial like the ones I've done does require that support because it's time, effort, possibly, in my case, energy, depletion. I wanted to be certain that the people around me understood that I was undertaking this and helped support me in it and help me recover from anything that I might need to have help with.
Well, Dr. Kathy Zackowski and Mimi Brown, I want to thank you both for helping our listeners better understand the importance of clinical trials and the value of stepping up and participating in clinical research. That's the thing that moves the ball down the field. That's how we get progress in MS research. So thanks so much for what you do, and thanks so much for talking with me today.
Thank you so much for
having
us.
Thank you both. Thank you.
That's going to wrap up this episode of Real Talk MS. Real Talk MS is powered by the National MS Society, and you can share this episode of the podcast by letting your friends or family members know that all they have to do is point their web browser at realtalkms.com/379. You'll find that link in today's show notes, so you can easily copy and paste it right into an email or a text. And if you have a minute, I hope you'll visit the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store and download the free Real Talk MS app for your iOS or Android smartphone or tablet. It's the best way for us to stay connected. The app will automatically download the latest episode of Real Talk MS. You'll be able to access any of our past episodes. You'll be able to save your favorite episodes. And it's a great way for me to share bonus content with you, like the special report on brain health we're including with this week's episode of the podcast. The app is free, so I hope you'll download it today. I'm John Strum. Thanks for listening. Stay safe and make healthy choices.